Without our involvement, changes happen without our consent.
Black communities in Canada have been marginalized and undervalued by the planning and design of cities. From the racist policies of urban renewal in the 1950s to the gentrification of cities throughout the 21st century, anti-Black racism is a force that is deeply rooted in North America. Unfortunately, Black Canadians have a long history of being excluded from urban planning decisions based on these false assumptions and stereotypes.
There is an absence and lack of Black businesses and organizations and leadership in the rooms that make decisions around our land use planning policies.
Why don't we see Black ethnic enclaves? Why don't we see Black services? Why don't we see Black people everywhere?
This has led to the unequal distribution and management of resources, including affordable housing, public transit, and food security. As a result, Black communities have been left without adequate access to services and opportunities.
We look at what happened with Africville, where people were forced out of their homes so that infrastructure could be built. The same thing in Hogan's Alley in Vancouver. These were cases where people specifically used city building as a way to kind of destroy and undermine Black communities that had been established for generations in cities.
And the impacts of anti-Black racism are still being felt today, with the ongoing gentrification of historically Black neighborhoods, the displacement of Black residents and businesses, and the uprooting of Black communities throughout the country. This lack of permanence often leaves Black communities feeling disconnected from the city and their neighborhoods.
Many times, urban planning, urban renewal has really been kind of almost like an ethnic cleansing of Black communities, of Black neighborhoods.
They have been taken apart from their schools, from their casual acquaintances in their neighborhood, and they have become poorer for it.
So how can we fix this? Cheryll Case of CP Planning has the right approach. Through bottom-up learning with an emphasis on engagement and empowerment, we can protect our Black communities in Canada by listening to their needs and providing them with the necessary tools and resources to implement their own solutions.
Black-led nonprofits have been practicing care for these communities for decades, and if you want to lift up the Black community, you have to enable them to be their own leaders.
When we invest in our community, we can see that it actually belongs to us and can't be taken away. And we still see a reflection of ourselves in the future.
The ways in which we build our cities haven't always led to the most equitable outcomes, and in some cases, has caused certain groups of people more harm than good.
So when I think of anti-Black racism in communities in Canada, I think of how planning as a profession and a process have used kind of the spatial mechanisms for control and power to shape our natural environment. It's embedded within the methodologies, within the policies, within the assumptions and the ideas around it. So it's been embedded for so long that it's been normalized. And in many ways, there are things that aren't questioned. But I think that's led people to get this sense that, whatever we're doing must be the right thing because it's so, formalized and certified and regulated. And, the ethics are woven throughout everything that we do. But I think there's a failure there to interrogate the history that is the planning practice.
And when we examine the ways historical thinkers and leaders made decisions about how our cities would grow, we can see that the enrichment and fulfillment of Black lives in cities simply weren't priorities. In many cases, racist and discriminatory views and perspectives led to the neglect and disappearance of Black communities throughout Canada through the intentional and systemic use of planning policy. We can understand this as anti-Black racism.
And the idea historically has been these mechanisms have been used to to enhance health, safety, quality of life for residents. But when you look at it a little deeper, you start to see that the distributions of benefits and just how growth and change show up haven't been equitable. Not equitable in the sense that our Black communities in particular have experienced disproportionately negative outcomes. And that's also kind of related to or a product of the institutionalized inequity. When you look at where the focus of investments, whether capital investments or infrastructure, where they are, it really tells you the historic story of marginalization, that these communities it was never intended that they would survive as long as they did, that they would thrive in the way that they did. And they did.
Throughout Canada's history, our planning policies and institutions have been established and utilized in ways that ensure these communities do not thrive. And Black Canadians have had to navigate these discriminatory systems, often with little support, making it that much harder to flourish.
Within the Western European model of formalized planning, again, the point was never to have us there. People of African descent, people who were stolen from the African continent, weren't even supposed to move into an understanding of what it meant to be human within legal definitions. And so when we think of humanness, and not to get into the philosophy of this, but that is connected to citizenship. And so if a population of people are essentially tied as a permanent underclass, and not even necessarily a laboring class, because there wasn't an exchange for the labor conducted. It was stolen labor. Then what you have is a perpetual class of people and population who are fighting for civil rights from the beginning of the formation of what Canada is. And that's really what we saw with the Black population.
Not only can we observe the historical lack of acknowledgement or care in ensuring that Black people thrived in Canada, but we can also examine how our governments use planning systems and policy decisions to intentionally destroy and diminish Black communities.
There's more to it. These things happened over time. They happened in boardrooms. They happened, deliberately and intentionally and systematically and systemically.
These were purposeful decisions that were made often within city halls. These were political decisions and bureaucratic decisions as well.
In order to justify their removal and destruction, Black communities were portrayed as dilapidated, blighted, unsafe, and eyesores in the city.
Similar to other cities, there was a level of just specific attack, whether it was ensuring garbage pickups weren't happening, just that level of ensuring that a community that is often tied to some level of class discrimination and race discrimination appears derelict and appears mismanaged. And oftentimes, again, that comes down to city decisions.
Africville, on the outskirts of Halifax, was a Black community dating back to 1848. For decades, the city of Halifax refused to provide residents clean drinking water. By 1970, the city had relocated all of Africville's residents. Some of them were moved in garbage trucks.
This made it very easy to convince a voting class that these areas needed to be raised, redeveloped, and recovered for the highest and best use, typically involving economic goals in which Black communities were seen as a hindrance. As such, methods of redevelopment, under the guise of urban renewal, were implemented that sparked both the symbolic and literal demolition of many prominent Black communities in Canada.
That history and that story needs to be told, because there's an ongoing narrative, unfortunately, of these communities being, communities in need of help, communities in need of being fixed, and that type of an idea. So the idea that this community needs to be fixed is inherently problematic. Instead, these communities need to be supported. The equity work needs to happen.
A lot of these decisions were considered best practices, and that's just the reality. It's, as a planner, I see it today where we very much still will use language around best practice and reviewing what another jurisdiction is doing. And if it on the surface seems to have worked for them, we incorporate it or we import it as an innovation. And these were innovations as well. And urban renewal was the standard of the day. It was the standard for CMHC, which was a part of this. It was the standard for engineering departments. It was considered good, rationale, engineering and planning practice. And so that's how it was able to happen.
Despite these being seen as best practices based on expert opinion and intended to provide benefit to cities, the impacts of these decisions tell a different story for community. And this has led to understandable contentions over how helpful or well-intended these planning decisions really were.
But that's just how the system operates, right? It pathologizes, it makes these places need fixing, need intervention. And most times the intervention is one to just, entirely just decapitate or to cut away and just remove entirely these communities. And the blame falls squarely on the communities instead of the government for the lack of the services, for the transgenerational disservice that happens. These things are a product of their time, yes, but there's no reason why we cannot review them, redevelop them, rework them to be more culturally appropriate, more responsive to the interests, needs, and priorities of the communities today.
Anti-Black racism in urban planning is a continuous and ongoing process. Although modern planning bodies and officials have acknowledged the history of discriminatory and harmful planning decisions, Black people continue to be excluded from participatory city building and consultation processes.
Black people have been excluded from the civic engagement of deciding how land is used in quite a number of ways. From a historical sense, there have been discussions around that only homeowners should be able to vote, that only homeowners should have the ability to decide whether or not a development in the neighborhood should be approved or not. In Toronto, being a homeowner was an incredibly important way to have access to being a part of the discussion. The people who are most likely to engage in planning processes are people who have wealth and are established. So it's typically wealthy white homeowners. In fact, the City of Toronto released a report some years ago that stated that the average person engaging in a community planning consultation is a white, wealthy homeowner over the age of 55. Even though this is not the demographic who is most in need of our government services of community planning.
Things tend to move ahead based on the opinions and perspectives of those who are either loudest or who are able to participate, whether it's because they understand the process or they have accessible means to be engaged. Accessibility is a key factor, and I don't mean just in terms of persons with disabilities. That's a big one, but I also mean in terms of how many or what the opportunities for participation look like. So are we creating enough opportunities for people to participate?
The right to be heard and involved in city building was a privilege typically not afforded to Black Canadians, and the lack of consultation has resulted in negative impacts on the Black community and their ability to voice their concerns.
So when we think about anti-Black racism in city building, there's a couple ways we can think about it. One is the fact that Black experiences, Black culture, the lives of Black folks tend to be ignored or undervalued when people do planning processes. The other block is many well-meaning progressive folks have thought that by talking about issues Black people face, you reinforce stereotypes about Black folks. And so there was a whole generation of people in government who said we can never talk about race because we need to protect these people from racism. And the way to do that is pretending that race doesn't exist. And there was good intent behind that, but what it meant is the issues Black folks were talking about, whether it was over-policing, whether it was streaming in schools, whether it was issues of poverty, were ignored and lost because people weren't collecting the data. They weren't having open conversations.
This also makes it incredibly difficult to dismantle the racist ideologies that have been baked into our systems and to meaningfully acknowledge our history with racism.
Canada has this ability to really frame itself as being, the softer, neutral, kinder, gentler neighbor to the United States. And so there's sometimes no room for the conversations around the policy-oriented forms of racism that have occurred.
We have this Canadian mythology that racism isn't an issue here, that we always look at ourselves in relative comparison to the United States, and people say, well, we didn't have slavery in Canada, which of course we did, but just for a couple decades less. But in people's minds, we didn't have it here. We didn't have, Jim Crow or segregation, even though we had de facto segregation in communities. We can look at incarceration rates for young black men and black women in this country. We can look at issues of racial profiling, police brutality. Basically, we see very similar patterns, not the exact same as the United States. The degree and the magnitude might be less in some cases here, but we have this Canadian illusion that things are so much worse in the US, and so people should be grateful to just be in this multicultural tapestry of Canada. And Canada's a great place. We do pretty well on these issues, but that's in comparison to a global scale where people of African descent are marginalized, discriminated against, over-policed all over the world. So we may do it a little less here than in other places, but it doesn't mean it isn't an issue. But for people to come to terms with that, it means smashing some of these myths we tell ourselves about our country and how successful integration and multiculturalism has been in here. And I think that's the biggest cultural block.
The lack of consultation and acknowledgement surrounding the issues Black Canadians face is also extremely concerning in a landscape of real estate capitalism that has often neglected and disposed of these communities. At its core, real estate capitalism aims to reap the benefits of access to the valuable land these communities live on by extracting as much value from it as possible, even if that comes at the cost of the existing community itself.
There's a sense that there's no plan for us to remain where we are long term. The minute we become interesting in the real estate sense, we're at risk because we've been set up to be removable. We've been set up to be displaced.
Case example that's in the news right now, the Eglinton Crosstown, this really vital piece of infrastructure built in the city that went straight through Little Jamaica, one of the more established Black communities, Black business districts in the city. And there wasn't even a thought of what the impact would be, that this is an important part of our cultural fabric that needed to be protected. It was just, no, we're gonna build this. And it seemed like maybe 8 or 9 years into the process, the institutional powers realized, oh, actually Black neighborhoods matter. This place is actually important. We actually need to think about the impact.
It was a very well-known fact that investing in transit would lead to property values going up. Unfortunately, our government has not invested in planning for affordable housing to be built. The city completed their Eglinton Connect study in 2014, and you'd be hard-pressed to find the word affordability or affordable in that report. So in return for billions of dollars in transit investment, Black and marginalized communities who are renting have been displaced from their neighborhoods.
As we know, when you add new infrastructure, when you add a subway line, when you add a new community center, the property value of residences nearby increase. The incentive for landlords is increase the rent. For those homes that are for sale, the real estate agents are gonna put the listing prices up because there's new amenities. That makes sense, that's how the market works, but what that means is the people who've lived in these neighborhoods when they didn't have the good stuff now are finding themselves priced out of their communities right at the time where all of these great investments come in. And so we have this perverse piece where we look at communities, we pour public investments in, but the people who need it the most are now pushed out and moved to another part of the city that doesn't have the investment. And so we keep pushing people to the fringes or till they leave the city entirely. And then what we get is middle class, upper middle class people enjoy these neighborhoods, which were traditionally working class communities.
That becomes concerning for the communities who historically have lived there and enjoyed these things, but now, they're of the interest of the capitalist machine. So what happens to the folks who have very little protection from that machine?
There have been so many changes in our community, especially with developments like the LRT. One, I can even say for many years, I've watched, and I'm not the only witness to this, but when you're taking the Eglinton West bus, the 32 bus, up or down, you'll see just a lot of closed doors, closed signs, for lease signs, for sale signs. A lot of businesses are pushed out of the community, and that's one of the things we advocate for as a community group, as a residents group, is to keep our culture through our businesses here. Without economic development, we don't have the jobs to put food on our tables and to keep a roof over our head. But we are advocating as a community group to get more things done, especially with developers that are still coming into our community and have a long ways to go. So we're having those conversations as well as with the LRT and Metrolinx. We like to say, well, we don't like to say, we truly believe that gentrification only happens when the community is not involved. It's revitalization when the community is involved. So with our involvement, we have to be active with our involvement, and we have to push forward our demands so that we are recognized, our place is recognized, and our stance is recognized so that we could actually make the changes that our community wants and needs.
Although there is critical knowledge present within these communities, Black Canadians have continued to be excluded and pushed out by racist systems and ideologies. What this has meant is that the folks who have the knowledge, ideas, and lived experience to effectively speak to and challenge the structural impacts of anti-Black racism are not being heard or utilized at the decision-making level.
We almost never discuss what non-formalized planning look like to communities, First Nations communities here, and then also within communities, specifically across the African continent, which the Black diaspora has its roots in. And there's a long history of processes of city building and decision making. And so it's really important to start having that level of conversation, I think, as well. That would really support an understanding how we as Black people and as displaced Black people really see ourselves in relation to place and space, and have done so historically.
A lot of the priorities in these communities, whether it's needs or interests and aspirations of communities, are often missing from the conversation, because what's best for communities, the idea of what's best for communities tends to come from the offices, from the ivory towers of planning. And that's deeply problematic, because folks have been doing planning for many, many generations, folks in the Black community. It just wasn't called that. It just wasn't recognized as that. But they've made do with the conditions that they were, placed in. And not only made do, but they've thrived and they've prospered. So it's really a disservice to planning professions to not tap into that knowledge and that wisdom.
Anti-Black racism in planning has also significantly impacted the ability of Black communities to generate fiscal and social generational wealth through the destruction and loss of community, both as a physical space and as a social net.
There aren't culturally specific services. When folks are displaced, oftentimes they still attempt to remain in close proximity to the area that they were in because there were services. But we also know a major part of displacement and gentrification as well, and those pressures is not just the displacement of residential components of a neighborhood, but it's also the services, it's the retail, it's the health services, it's all of that community build up over the years that folks organized around and met each other's needs through. And as I mentioned, if you're losing out on the services, if you're losing out on the retail, if you're losing out on health services, if you're losing out on child rearing supports, which you would find in community where there's familiarity components, then essentially you are losing out across a spectrum of wealth. So I don't want to just look at generational wealth as if it just comes down to the finances and the money in folks' bank accounts. But what we're seeing as a result of development pressures, we're seeing less and less of those established communities. And then therefore we're seeing less and less of the forms of community formation and supports.
And this contributes to serious impacts for the Black community through the loss of cultural services and spaces, affecting the goals and ambitions of these folks, as well as implications on the social well-being and mental health of the community members.
There's this looming sense of, being the folks who are going to be serially displaced. And that serial displacement is not just a myth or a boogeyman or anything like that. It's the reality of it. The story repeats itself over and over and over. And that's the most terrifying thing about it. People cannot dream about their future.
As a result of a sense of perpetual displacement, the Black community never really has a chance to catch their breath and actually build a community. We're more, at this point, a Black population than we are a Black community, and that's because the city is experiencing so many crises and constraints that by the time it trickles down to those who also experience anti-Black racism and the numerous other marginalizations, especially class and poverty, they're just going to feel it, 10 times more.
One of the simplest actions to take towards building more equitable communities is through acknowledgement. Cultural enclaves, such as historically Black neighborhoods, provide space for residents to call home, community networks and support systems, and the ability for any and everyone to access and engage with a multitude of cultural offerings. One of the things we pride ourselves the most on in Canada. As such, it is critical that we preserve and support these incredibly important spaces.
Cultural communities like Little Jamaica are incredibly important to protect because they are a space where these diverse communities are able to more authentically express their cultural way of being and of relating to others in ways that you would not find in other neighborhoods. So, as a city, as a country, we consider ourselves to be a mosaic, and so we must protect the ability for people to have choice to live in spaces like Little Jamaica and not to erase that ability from our landscape.
There's all kinds of issues that happen when you feel like a foreigner in your own city. And so these places are so important. And you can read it from reports of folks. Like when I was doing work around Black communities in Toronto, people who were coming in the 50s and the 60s from the Caribbean talked about how important it was to have a West Indian grocer to go to have a place where your music was played, to have a place where you could celebrate with your culture. These are the things that let people feel grounded when they did that huge journey to come to this cold country that was thousands of miles away from where they grew up. So arrival communities, ethnocultural communities, they help everyone. They help to create bridges, if you think in the social capital sense, but they also help to create bonds. They help communities to connect to each other. And strong, resilient communities are communities that are able to economically contribute, are communities that are able to give back to the fullest length, and we all benefit from that. We've seen in so many examples what happens when certain communities are left behind. It actually is damaging for the fabric of our entire city.
So, now knowing all that we know, how can we as Canadians support and uplift Black communities in Canada? Well, the first step is to begin engaging in equitable conversations with these marginalized communities.
So community engagement is incredibly important, and that's because there's a lot of vital knowledge in these communities that have not been integrated into the formal planning process.
For the longest time, there has been this idea that there must be a level of expertise, that there must be a level of credentials before anyone can actually play a role in kind of crafting plans for neighborhoods, that local people just don't know enough about the systems or the technical details to make informed decisions, and they are resources that we collect data from, but then it must be experts who analyze and who then solve the problems or come up with an array of solutions based on what local people do. And I think what it's meant is all the blind spots, all the gaps in knowledge that those planners have, that those people making decisions have, fall into the plans that are created.
So when city planning started working in Little Jamaica, we asked communities, what should we be prioritizing and what can we do to support you in this planning process? And they told me that we want to do tenant organizing as part of the planning process because we have immediate needs that need to be met. And so that has been integrated into the planning process where now we're building these tenant associations, and now we have a network of folks and tenants, people who are most likely not to be engaged in planning, providing their feedback into questions like, what do you think is appropriate housing in your neighborhood? What levels of affordability? How tall? Things that they typically are not in the room to provide their feedback on.
You can ask them about how would you feel safe in your neighborhood? What is it in your neighborhood that is supporting people? Like, how do neighbors look out for each other? How do kids safely move through these buildings? And how do we take those insights and then put them into the design of our lobbies, into the design of the public amenities and spaces? When you do that, when people are coming together, you get actually communities that are not going to be perfect, but are much more likely to not have many of the pitfalls that generations of planning had, right? The housing projects that we see as being so deficient today, generations ago were seen as the best idea in the world. They were like these socialist worker utopias, where you'd have these great courtyards where people would hang out. It didn't work out like that. But part of it was that was a generation of planners who didn't think for a moment to ask working class people, poor people, what they wanted to see in their communities. They thought they knew, they gave it to them, and then people had to live through the mistakes and the blind spots that those planners had.
We also must remember to think critically about the spaces and places in which we engage with community.
there's a tendency to want folks to come to us, and I mean us as government, instead of us going out into community. And there's a lot of barriers that come with that expectation. And also the locations that we choose to have, say, public information meetings. We often like to be in quote unquote central areas, in the downtown areas. And we're planning for communities without communities. We're planning for communities outside of communities.
When planners go out to do their work, when people do work around, thinking about our urban life, I think it has to be a prerequisite, it has to be a requirement that before you even start, you do an analysis, an equity analysis to think about who will be impacted by what we're doing and who is the most vulnerable here and who typically has the least amount of social power to influence these processes. My business partner Zara, she always talks about you move at the speed of trust. And sometimes, yes, it's important to be efficient, but if we're moving so quickly that we leave communities behind, that people don't understand what's happening, it actually comes back to us because then those folks are the ones pushing against it. They're protesting, they're angry, they're creating issues that slow down the development process. So especially at the beginning, taking the time to move with community, to really explain to people what is happening, why, where we want to hear their voice, and where there's opportunities for them to have real power and influence, actually leads to a more effective process overall, and not to mention one that actually lives up to that obligation to make sure those who are most impacted have a voice and a seat at the table.
Secondly, we can do so much more than just providing a listening ear. In order to fully support the Black community, resources, tools, and most importantly, decision-making power and agency need to be provided by our political leaders.
Planning bodies have the responsibility to invest in Black-led organizations who have been practicing care and supporting the economic and social well-being of Black people. These are the groups that are best positioned to actually build trust with, respond to, and carry out actions in support of these communities.
The onus falls on government as well to build the capacities of communities to be involved as active agents in these processes, because it's one thing just to say, hey, come to the table. But if they're not equipped to be able to be, equal partners in the activities at the table, then I don't think the outcomes will be beneficial for communities. So a lot of work needs to happen there to make sure that it's truly, truly beneficial and truly community-centric.
And there are many mechanisms which our planning bodies can utilize to empower Black communities by giving them the necessary supports to thrive. In regard to displacement and supporting tenants, one commonly practiced housing solution is the development of community land trusts, or CLTs. A CLT is a nonprofit corporation that holds land on behalf of a place-based community while serving as a long-term steward for affordable housing, community gardens, civic buildings, commercial spaces, and other community assets on behalf of a community. One recent example of this is with the Nora Hendricks Place modular housing development in Vancouver's Hogan's Alley neighborhood, a project led by the Hogan's Alley Society and in partnership with the City of Vancouver and the BC provincial government.
So right now, we're at 258 Union, which is where we have Nora Hendricks Place. And that's what this, what's coming to be a famous mural now on the side of Nora Hendricks Place is. And as you can see, we're right next to the viaducts as well, which was a big part in contributing to the displacement of the Black community. In 2019, BC Housing and the City of Vancouver came to the understanding that there were some immediate decisions that needed to be made to tackle the housing crisis, especially for unhoused populations, and temporary modular homes became that fix. And so Hogan's Alley Society, through the Northeast False Creek Plan, and the working group that was established, and specifically the section around redress, saw this as an opportunity to ensure that one of the temporary housing modules were committed to the Black community. And so that's how we ended up with Nora Hendricks Place. And what we have here is on the site where the community was displaced and in very close proximity to additional areas of displacement, is we've got a 52-unit studio temporary modular housing site. 10% of the units on this site are accessible, and it meets the immediate needs of the most marginalized members of our community. This was a really great step in relation to the Community Land Trust that we're looking to further develop, and the Memorandum of Understanding that we got to last year with the City of Vancouver. And so within that Community Land Trust are the goals that we have to ensure that on this block we do see a residential component of development, but that we also see needs around childcare being met, a cultural center that continues to daylight and highlight the history of Black people, but also the present reality and what we understand today as Afrofuturism with regards to the Black diaspora and what that looks like in the city of Vancouver for Black people who are low income and across the spectrum of needs as well within our community.
Nora Hendricks Place is one example of the incredible housing work being pushed forward by Black Canadians throughout the country to support Black communities and redress for the historic and ongoing impacts of anti-Black racism. But there is still more work to be done, and with the right support, voices, and direction, we can truly work towards making more equitable Canadian cities.
I could say there's a story of hope. There's a story of, immense momentum right now with regards to planning in our Black communities.
The awareness raising is forever work, and the pointing to it is forever work, and the advocacy is going to be forever work out here.
We are seeing increased courage to say the word Black people, to talk about it in public policy, and I think we're moving to a paradigm that says local people are experts in things, including their own lives and their own neighborhoods. And someone who's lived in a community and walks it and breathes it every day actually has rich knowledge about what works and what doesn't work. And if we don't tap into that form of expertise, along with people who have a theoretical framework, then we're not going to see the blind spots that are there.
Redress for systemic anti-Black racism, limiting the ability for Black people to have access to good jobs, good housing, an adequate standard of living, and access to cultural services means to invest in Black-led organizations. We need the support to do the work that needs to be done. So donate, volunteer, do your best to support these organizations to thrive, because it's through their success that we can actually see anti-Black racism really conquered in our country.